Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my lecture recital. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a lecture recital is, this is the portion of my doctoral degree program in which I demonstrate my ability as a scholar and performer and my ability to relate scholarship to performance. This is done by presenting research on a particular piece of music or category of pieces, and then performing some or all of that music. Today I'll be discussing and performing the Requiem Mass, or Messe de Requiem, of the 19th century French composer Camille Saint-Saëns. This is a piece that I first encountered 4 years ago as a member of the music faculty at Arizona Western College. I had never heard of the piece before, much less actually heard the piece, and the more I studied and rehearsed the piece, the more I wondered why I had never heard it. As I have researched the piece further, I have learned that much of Saint-Saëns' music has suffered a similar fate due to an unfortunate coincidence of chronology. Saint-Saëns died in 1921 when the modernist movement in classical music was in full swing. Saint-Saëns himself was not a modernist and openly disapproved of what the modernists were doing. As a result, although he was one of the most revered French composers of the 19th century, by the time of his death, he as a person had fallen strongly out of favor in the musical community. As a result, most of his music has been largely forgotten. I would like to note at the outset that the version of the piece that you will hear at the end of today's event is not the original version. In its original form, the piece is scored for full orchestra, 4 vocal soloists, and choir. Unfortunately, I just couldn't get Dr. Cockrell to give me his orchestra, so we will be performing a version of the piece in which the orchestral wind parts are condensed and played by the organ. As you will hear at the end of this recital, the Saint-Saëns Requiem is a magnificent piece of music that expresses deep religious and human emotion in a beautiful way. It is my hope that through my research and future publication on this piece, it will be given greater attention, both in the form of scholarship and performance. This study will explore the stylistic origins of Camille Saint-Saëns' Messe de Requiem and the work's relationship to trends in the composition of requiems in 19th century Paris. Of primary interest is the way in which Saint-Saëns combines 2 trends which, upon first consideration, seem mutually incompatible. On one hand, the dramatic trend, exemplified by the Grande Messe des Morts of Hector Berlioz, and imitated by a number of other Parisian composers over the course of the century. And on the other hand, the conservative, anti-dramatic, ecclesiastical trend, represented by 2 of Gounod's Requiem settings, the Messe breve pour les morts and the Messe funèbre. This combination of drama and restraint is of particular interest in that it prefigures the famous Requiem of Gabriel Fauré, who was among Saint-Saëns' students at the École Niedermeyer, and who remained Saint-Saëns' close friend for the rest of his life. It is my assertion that in the composition of his Messe de Requiem, Camille Saint-Saëns sought to unite these 2 compositional trends in a single piece. The spirit of the resulting work is more subdued in nature than the dramatic requiems of Berlioz, his predecessors and imitators, but its style is harmonically and instrumentally richer, as well as more expressive than the conservative requiems like those of Gounod. Statement of primary thesis. The Messe de Requiem, Opus 54, 1878, of Camille Saint-Saëns constitutes an amalgamation of 2 contrasting stylistic trends in church music composition which were current in 19th century Paris. The dramatic, operatic tradition exemplified in the Grande Messe des Morts 1837 of Hector Berlioz, and the conservative ecclesiastical tradition represented by the Messe breve pour les morts 1873 and Messe funèbre 1883 of Charles Gounod. Review of the scholarly literature. The Saint-Saëns Requiem has received very little attention in the scholarly literature. There are only 2 articles specifically addressing this piece. One is Paul Thyssen's 2005 article in the Kirchenmusikalisches Jahrbuch, the Messe de Requiem of Camille Saint-Saëns and its meaning for the genre tradition in France. And 2, a section of the chapter entitled More et Apocalypse, or Death and Apocalypse, in François Labille's The Face of Christ in the Music of the 19th and 20th centuries. Labille's brief discussion is of relatively minor consequence to the present study, being mostly a review of the piece. However, he does briefly mention the influence of Berlioz and Verdi, while also describing the piece as, quote, owing a debt to the Requiem of Liszt, end quote, which is in a style very similar to the Saint-Saëns Motets and the 1873 and 1883 Gounod Requiems. Moreover, he states that, quote, liturgical simplicity and operatic embellishments mingle in the voices of the soloists, end quote, and this is likely the seed from which my understanding of the piece as an amalgamation of dramatic and conservative grew. Labille is critical of the piece, calling it contresens, or misinterpretation, and saying that, quote, the imploring passages like the Recordare Pie Jesu or the Ingemisco hold more of the mundane request than the spiritual supplication, end quote. Yet here, Labie seems to have forgotten his own interpretation of the piece as a combination of dramatic and liturgical, misinterpreting the composer's restraint as a lack of dramatic impetus. In summary, he states, quote, "More than a discourse of the believer on death, its terrors, and on hope in the beyond, it is an elegant symphonic poem in minor tonality that Saint-Saëns offers us," end quote. Paul Tisson's article is more analytical and attempts to place the Saint-Saëns Requiem at the opposite end of a spectrum from the Berlioz Requiem, this apparently constituting its so-called meaning for the genre tradition in France. Quote, "The view of the Fauré Requiem, representing as it were the antithesis to the Berlioz Grande Messe des Morts, is found everywhere, be it in the secondary literature, in liner notes, or in concert reviews. But in reality, one comes closer to an inwardly oriented Requiem conception, which stands in stark contrast to that of Berlioz, by going back not to Fauré, but to Camille Saint-Saëns," end quote. By implication here, Tisson is presenting the idea that the Saint-Saëns Requiem is the impetus for the change in the French approach to Requiem composition, which most associate with Fauré. The author goes on to briefly discuss those Requiems that were composed between Berlioz's and Saint-Saëns, after which he gives a detailed analysis of the Saint-Saëns, noting that although Saint-Saëns was clearly interested in the reform of sacred music, quote, "The structure of the instrumental introduction to the introitus of his Requiem makes clear in an obvious way that an orientation toward church music reform efforts must in no way imply a Cecilian simplification and reduction to a mere style copy," end quote. The other primary influence on my thinking regarding the Saint-Saëns Requiem has been Jane Snyder's dissertation entitled Ritual and Drama in the 19th-Century French Requiem. A musicological study, this work is in essentially three parts. 1. A discussion of the history of the Catholic Church's writings on sacred music from its earliest days. 2. A discussion of sacred music criticism in France during the 19th century. And 3. An application of the previous discussions to the Berlioz Grande Messe des Morts and the Fauré Requiem. It is primarily through this dissertation and the sources she references that I have constructed my understanding of the church music reform movement in France in the 19th century, and, to a somewhat lesser extent, of the French taste for the dramatic during that same period. My study will be a more in-depth exploration of the ideas mentioned above. 1. That the Saint-Saëns Requiem is a combination of sacred and dramatic, owing a debt both to the dramatic music of the period, as well as to the more conservative French church music of the period. And 2. That his Requiem is similar in style to the Fauré Requiem, representing as such something of an antipode to the Berlioz Requiem. It will differ from Labie's work in that where Labie comments on the effect created for the listener, this study will examine the stylistic influences of the piece that bring about that aural experience. It will also differ from Tisson's, which is mostly a movement-by-movement harmonic and structural analysis, with occasional commentary on the affect created. This study will be unique, primarily in that it will present the first detailed analysis of the stylistic influences on the Saint-Saëns Requiem, and indeed the first in-depth study of the piece of any kind. The dramatic tradition in 19th century French Requiems. The French interest in the dramatic extends back at least into the 16th century. According to John Walter Hill, quote, "In 1581, the Ballet Comique de la Reine, or the Dramatic Ballet of the Queen, initiated a series of court ballets that became the central tradition of French musical spectacle for the entire Baroque era, eclipsed only temporarily by opera during the 1670s and 1680s," end quote. According to Stephen Studd, this aspect of French taste continued its dominance during Saint-Saëns' lifetime. Quote, "The French composer was of a culture dominated by the visual and decorative, to which music was subservient, in that it existed primarily to provide operatic and balletic spectacle. And even in opera, he was expected to work in a style essentially at odds with native tradition, the Italian bel canto style. Italian opera fed an appetite for pomp, pageantry, spectacle, and melodrama, and provided Parisian audiences with regular doses of ostentatious diversion and escapism," end quote. Parisians also expected to hear dramatic music in their church services, and, disregarding the edicts of the church, which will be discussed later, some of the clergy catered to this taste. After replacing Louis Lefebvre-Velly as organist at the Church of the Madeleine, Saint-Saëns made significant changes to the music that was heard at the services of that most fashionable of parishes. While he admired Lefebvre-Velly's technique, Saint-Saëns described his playing as, quote, "too frequently marred by a frivolous and secular style," end quote, and himself often chose, quote, the plain chant of the offertory as the subject of an improvisation, for I almost always improvised. But with such methods I could not be diverting like my predecessor, whom many listeners regretted, end quote. A story from Saint-Saëns' time at the Madeleine illustrates the difficulties he encountered as a result of his more reserved approach to music for the Mass. Saint-Saëns recounts, quote, one of the vicars of the parish sent a request that I should visit him. I called upon him as desired, and after a lengthy discourse, which was quite unintelligible to me, he finally came to the point. Do not misunderstand me, he said. The parishioners of the Madeleine are for the most part persons of wealth who frequently go to the theatre of the Opéra Comique, where they have become accustomed to a style of music to which you are expected to conform. Monsieur l'Abbé, I replied, whenever I shall hear the dialogue of the Opéra Comique spoken in the pulpit, I will play music appropriate to it. Until then, I shall continue as hitherto. Perhaps due to the Parisian taste for the dramatic, the majority of requiem settings by French composers during the 18th and 19th century fall under the category of concert requiem, a composition based to a greater or lesser degree on the text of the Requiem Mass, but which was not intended for use in a liturgical setting. According to Christopher Thomas, Belgian composer François-Joseph Cossec was the first composer to write such a piece, his Grande Messe des Morts of 1760. Quote, some succeeding composers, including Luigi Cherubini in Requiem in C minor and Antonin Reicha in Missa pro defunctis, contributed to compositional innovation in the concert requiem that culminated with a work of colossal proportions, Hector Berlioz's Grande Messe des Morts of 1837, end quote. Robert Chase elaborates further, quote, the concert requiem was designed for performance in the concert hall and on the operatic stage. An obvious indication of this transformation is the extension of the work's performance time. Although the 18th century requiem's liturgical function regulated it to a performance time of 40 to 50 minutes, the larger scale models of Gossec, Paisiello, Meyer, Eibler, and Cimarosa served to foreshadow the style that would eventually become the Romantic standard, end quote. As Thomas indicates, the concert requiem reached its apotheosis in Berlioz's Requiem, and composers for decades after continued to imitate the Berlioz style in the composition of requiem settings. It is worth noting that many of these more dramatic requiems, whether liturgical or concert works, were premiered in Paris. In her dissertation entitled Ritual and Drama in the 19th Century French Requiem, Jane Snyder has compiled a listing of all requiem performances reviewed in the Revue et Gazette Musicale, a musical periodical which was published in Paris from 1834 until 1879. In the first 6 years of its publication, the only requiems reviewed were those by Cherubini, Mozart, and Berlioz. All of these may be said to be of the dramatic type, even though the Cherubini was written for liturgical use. Beginning in 1840, new requiem settings began receiving reviews, and these new settings continued to proliferate over the following decades, although the Mozart, Cherubini, and Berlioz remained staples. Although the scores of most of these new requiem settings are either lost or inaccessible, the language used in the reviews of their premieres would seem to place them in the dramatic vein with the Berlioz Requiem. Salient style features of the Berlioz Requiem, focusing on the composer's techniques for creating drama. The Berlioz Grande Messe des Morts of 1837 is certainly among the most famous of the dramatic 19th century French requiems. Indeed, its premiere was considered something of a revelation. One reviewer wrote in the Revue et Gazette Musicale, quote, we confess to have never heard in church a musical work that has moved us more deeply. And if we had to give our feelings the weight of authority, we could easily include many distinguished artists who shared them, end quote. The author goes on to describe the religious music of previous generations as cold and out of place, and the religious music of his own generation as eclectic and bastardized. He describes a, quote, musical anarchy today in the choirs of our churches, some rushing headlong into the excesses of secular music, the other, under the reactive feeling of pious rage, wanting us to return to the times of childhood in Palestrina and Orlando di Lasso, end quote. In the end, he concludes that prior to the Berlioz Requiem, there had been no real religious music, even going so far as to say, quote, we do not believe, in fact, that Christian thought in the Middle Ages can be better or more accurately understood than is reflected in the Requiem of Mr. Berlioz, end quote, and that the premiere of this work marked, quote, a whole new era for sacred music. It is apparent that the author of this review considered the dramatic expression of Christian thought to be the element of the Berlioz Requiem that made it the first piece of real religious music. I have identified 4 salient features of the Berlioz Requiem that contribute to its sense of drama. 1, the overall scale. 2, the wide dynamic range with frequent dynamic contrast. 3, the frequent use of imitative and non-imitative counterpoint, and 4, the use of large-scale tonal progressions employing chromaticism typical of 19th century compositions. 1. Overall scale. At around 90 minutes in length and employing more than 400 performers, the sheer scale of the Berlioz Requiem is among the most dramatic aspects of this monument of the choral orchestral repertoire. The orchestra consists of no fewer than 165 players, with 4 extra brass bands of 10, 8, 8, and 12 players, respectively, for a total of over 200 instrumentalists. To balance this orchestra, Berlioz specifies a choir of at least 210, but indicates that the choir may be enlarged so long as the orchestra is also enlarged to balance, while still stipulating that the choir should be no larger than 400 for most movements. 2. Wide dynamic range with frequent dynamic contrast. The overall written dynamic range of the Berlioz Requiem extends from quadruple piano to double forte. However, to fully comprehend the actual dynamic range that one experiences in listening to this work, one must consider the forces Berlioz employs at the moments of loudest dynamic. Perhaps the loudest moment of the entire work occurs near the end of the Tuba Mirum, where Berlioz represents the call of the trumpet on the Day of Judgment by using not only the entire orchestra simultaneously, but also the 4 extra brass bands and the choir singing high in their register. At this point, although the written dynamic marking is only double forte, the actual dynamic experienced by the listener is significantly louder. In addition to, and perhaps more significant than this wide dynamic range, is the frequent dynamic contrasts that Berlioz employs. For example, only 2 measures after the loudest moment in the piece, which was just described, the instrumental forces are stripped away and the choir sings unaccompanied at a written piano dynamic that is also marked sotto voce. Such extreme dynamic contrast is common in this work and is one of the primary contributors to the sense of drama that defines this work. We will now hear a recorded example of this dynamic contrast in the Berlioz Requiem. Please play track number 1. 3. Frequent use of imitative and non-imitative counterpoint. The vocal and instrumental texture of the Berlioz Requiem varies widely over the course of the piece. However, particularly in the vocal writing, the composer shows a preference for counterpoint, especially when the text expresses agitation. For example, at the choir's first entrance in the first movement, when the text is pleading for God to grant rest to the dead, the basses present the primary theme, after which the tenors introduce a counter melody doubled by the bassoons. This melody and counter melody are exchanged among the 3 choral voices for several measures until, at rehearsal 2, the choral voices divide into 3 distinct motivic ideas. Although these ideas bear some relationship to one another, the overall effect is one of heterogeneity and therefore of tension. Similarly, at the beginning of the second movement, where the text describes the Judgment Day as a day of wrath, the 3 choral voices sing 3 different themes that are entirely independent of one another. This use of heterogeneous themes in the choral voices continues throughout the first section of this movement and is, moreover, a common feature of the work overall. We will now hear an example of non-imitative counterpoint in the Berlioz Requiem. Please play track 2. 4. Use of large-scale tonal progressions employing chromaticism typical of 19th century compositions. In describing the harmonic practice he employed in his Requiem and other so-called architectural or monumental compositions, Berlioz made the following statement, quote, "It is above all the sheer scale, quote, "It is above all the scale of the movements, the breadth of style, and the formidably slow and deliberate pace of certain progressions, whose final goal cannot be guessed, that gives these works their gigantic character and colossal aspect," end quote. Since a full harmonic analysis of this piece is outside the scope of this study, it will suffice to say that Berlioz's large-scale tonal plan, combined with the use of chromatic harmony that is typical of the time period, contributes to the sense of drama that characterizes this piece. The conservative tradition, the Church's calls for restraint. The history of the Catholic Church's official stance regarding music in the Mass and divine offices is long and complex. For the purposes of this study, a summary of the musical proceedings of the Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563, and of Pope Benedict XIV's 1749 encyclical Annus Qui, will provide a backdrop for the discussion of the Church's conservatizing influence on sacred music in the 19th century. Robert F. Hayburn provides the following summary of the proceedings of the Council of Trent with regard to music in the Mass. Quote, "The Council of Trent was not concerned with the exact details of musical and stylistic problems, but rather with fundamental attitudes on its use in the liturgy. Some wished to have a total suppression of music in the services of the Church, but others wished to have a reform of music so that any improper, impure, or lascivious aspects should be removed. This second group wished to preserve chant and polyphonic music for worship, but wished them to be a help to those who assisted at Mass and the divine office, rather than a distraction," end quote. In September 1562, near the end of the Council of Trent, a committee of deputies drafted the following, quote, "All things should indeed be so ordered that the Masses, whether they be celebrated with or without singing, may reach tranquilly into the ears and hearts of those who hear them. In the case of those Masses which are celebrated with singing and with organ, let nothing profane be intermingled, but only hymns and divine praises. If anything is to be sung with the organ, let it be recited in a simple, clear voice beforehand, so that no one will miss any part of the eternal reading of the sacred writings. The whole plan of singing should be constituted not to give empty pleasure to the ear, but in such a way that the words may be clearly understood by all," end quote. Thus, the Council permitted the continuing use of polyphonic music in the Mass, but made clear that 1. Secular influences on sacred music were to be eliminated, 2. The attitude of singing in the Mass must reflect the solemnity of the occasion, and 3. The intelligibility of the liturgical texts must be preserved. The later Council of Toledo, 1566, which was concerned with the execution of the decrees of the Council of Trent, added that, quote, "It is absolutely necessary to avoid all that is theatrical in the music used for the chant of divine praises, and everything that evokes profane themes of love or warrior feats dear to classical music," end quote. Presumably due to the musically non-specific nature of the decrees of the Council of Trent, numerous practices deemed inappropriate by church leaders either persisted in spite of the Council or crept in over the following 2 centuries. As a result, in 1749, Pope Benedict XIV issued the encyclical letter entitled Annus Qui, which, although ostensibly concerned with preparing the churches for the influx of pilgrims associated with the coming Holy Year, spends most of its pages discussing a reform of the music used in the Church. It appears that this encyclical was among the primary motivations for the ensuing reform movements throughout the Roman Catholic world. Indeed, Hayburn calls it, quote, "one of the most important documents on church music. One may say, in fact, that it ranks second only to the November 22nd, 1903 motu proprio of Pope Pius X," end quote. The encyclical, described as long and full yet practical and clear, is in 9 sections. The first does not address music at all, and the second only insofar as ecclesiastics are enjoined to properly observe the divine offices, including the decree that, quote, "the chant be not executed precipitately or in too great a hurry." Another quote from this section of the encyclical shows the Pope's preference for monophonic chant over polyphony, here referred to as the chant called figurative. Quote, "It is this Gregorian chant which, if executed in God's churches according to the rules and with decorum, is more willingly listened to by devout men, and more rightly preferred to the chant called figurative," end quote. The second and third sections outline historical arguments from church leaders in opposition to and in favor of instrumental participation in church services, as well as the use of so-called harmonic or figurative chant, which, although never clearly defined, apparently refers to any sacred music other than Gregorian chant. Benedict concludes that instruments may be permitted and that, quote, "although in rhythmic or figurative chant many abuses may be introduced, as can happen also in all ecclesiastical ceremonies, it is licit in itself, and for no reason forbidden if executed with religious decency and judicious reserve," end quote. The fifth section, entitled Theatrical Kind, categorically condemns theatrical music in church largely on the authority of St. Jerome. The sixth section, Motets, discusses the widely varying opinions of a variety of clerics regarding the singing of motets, many of whom opposed the practice altogether. In the end, Benedict concludes that motets may be used so long as the dictates of the Council of Trent are observed, emphasizing especially the necessity of textual clarity. The seventh section of the letter, entitled Musical Instruments, discusses the necessity of, quote, "fixing the limits between church chant and music and that of the theaters," end quote. After discussing the opinions of a number of clerics regarding exactly what instruments could be used in religious services, Benedict concludes, quote, "You will not tolerate any instruments along with the organ except the tuba, the large and small tetrachord, the flute, the lyres, and the lute, provided that these serve to strengthen and support the voices. You will instead exclude the tambourines, corps da classe, trumpets, flutes, harps, guitars, and in general all instruments that give a theatrical swing to music. We only warn that instruments be used exclusively to uphold the chant of the words," end quote. In the eighth section, Orchestral Music, Benedict permits the continued use of orchestral music in the church, quote, "as long as it is serious and does not, because of its length, cause boredom or serious inconvenience to those who are in the choir or who are celebrating at the altar," end quote. In addition, he strongly condemns the, quote, "sumptuous and resounding concerts that often took place on days of special significance," specifically referencing the dramatic passion presentations that had become common. Although Benedict allows for orchestral music to continue being used in church services, his reluctance is evident. The final section, Practical Dispositions, discusses the implementation of the recommendations made. Quote, "Venerable brethren, do not fail to publish, if necessary, edicts and laws which are in harmony with our circular letters. By so acting, ecclesiastical chant will receive direction according to the rules which we have prescribed and firmly established in said letters, to the end that a start will be made in the reformation of church music," end quote. His language here indicates the desire to begin a reform movement regarding church music, which supports the idea that this encyclical was the impetus for the renewed church music reform movements, which took place throughout Europe in the ensuing decades. Benedict mentions that at the time of the encyclical, there were churches whose music was already in a state deemed appropriate. Among these, he must have had in mind the Cäcilienbündnisse, or Sicilian Leagues, which were organized in a number of prominent German-speaking cities in the 18th century. According to Siegfried Gemeinwieser, quote, "These organizations of church musicians upheld the ideal of sacred music with little or no instrumental accompaniment. The organ was one of the few instruments accepted as liturgically correct. Benedict's encyclical was cited as authority for excluding virtually all instruments from church services. They were to be admitted only to accompany the singers in a subordinate role, and in particular to reinforce small choirs," end quote. In addition to these restrictions on instrumental participation, chant was upheld as the ideal for use in the liturgy, and when polyphony was to be used, the compositional style of Palestrina was advocated. Although some of these organizations were already in existence prior to Pope Benedict's encyclical, it certainly would have served to further legitimize their goals and seems to have increased their influence. In the 19th century, these organizations enjoyed renewed influence due to the changing social and cultural climate. Gemeinwieser states, quote, "Cecilianism was nurtured by the early stages of industrialization, which engendered a longing for simplicity, unworldliness, and the past, and a concentration on essentials, and by the generally historicizing climate of the 19th century," end quote. As the 19th century progressed, the Sicilians became more organized and influential, culminating in the Pope's official sanction of the Society of St. Cecilia in December 1870. But their rigid conservatism isolated them from the musical mainstream. As a result, their influence was limited, both in that a limited number of composers subscribed completely to their ideals, and in that mainstream composers, such as Liszt and Bruckner, subscribed to their ideals only in a limited way. The French response. Although the German Sicilian Leagues are the best known of the conservatizing forces in sacred music in the 19th century, the desire for a reform of church music was also felt in France. While the reform movement in Germany took the form of organized societies, the French Revolution and the resultant decline in the influence of the Catholic Church in France meant that the response to the Church's call for reform came more slowly and more through public dialogue than through formally organized societies. A number of periodicals dedicated to sacred music appeared in France in the early to mid-19th century, and debate in these periodicals over the nature of sacred music was often heated. This attention to sacred music extended into the general musical press and prompted a renewed interest in early music, to the point that by the 1870s, a significant number of the Requiem performances given in Paris and reviewed in the Revue et Gazette Musicale were by 16th century composers. For many in France, as for Germans, quote, early music, and particularly Palestrina, presented the solution, end quote, to the problem of how to compose sacred music, and the sacred music press ultimately reached something of a consensus regarding the nature of sacred music. Jane Snyder summarizes it thus, quote, the consensus rejected chromatic harmonies, disjunct motion, complexity in rhythm, and the superimposition of rhythmic patterns. The ideal pointed to an approximation of Renaissance harmonies and rhythms with limited instrumentation grounded by the organ, namely the Palestrina style, end quote. Although both the German Sicilian Leagues and the French Sacred Musical Press saw Palestrina as the ideal, the consensus of the French press seems to have been less rigid than the Sicilian Leagues. Quoting again from Snyder, quote, at its most extreme, the French specialized sacred music press endeavored to rid sacred music of modern harmonies, orchestration, and melodic style. Moderates, on the other hand, discouraged an overtly theatrical style, but accepted a contemporary musical language tempered with 16th century polyphony and chant. End quote. Saint-Saëns was among these moderates. Born in 1835, he was in his teens and 20s when most of the sacred music periodicals began to be published, and although the extent of his involvement in the ongoing polemic in those publications is unknown, he spent much of his career as a church musician and had strong views regarding the nature of music for church services. This included, at least late in his life, a skepticism with regard to the establishment of chant and Palestrina polyphony as the ecclesiastical ideal. Quote, in reality, after so many centuries, we have lost the key to this ancient art of Gregorian chant. It is a dead language, and as such is imbued with an arcane nature which nothing could replace. One cannot be confined to 16th century music. By what right can the musical expression and devotion of succeeding centuries be ignored? End quote. On the other hand, in agreement with the exhortations of the Church, he adamantly rejected the use of theatrical music and secular concert pieces in the church services. Louis Vierne described Saint-Saëns' approach thus, quote, with the exception of Gounod, who was a cultivated man, church musicians during Saint-Saëns' time knew nothing of their art. To them, Latin was a formless gibberish which they set in any way to any kind of music, which most of the time was contrary to common sense and to the most elementary taste. With so strong a classical background, literary as well as musical, Saint-Saëns immediately understood the problem and, since he entered the arena, strove to combat it. He banished from his works all useless decoration and theatrical effects, end quote. Thus, although late in life he expressed distaste for the Church's call to return to chant and the polyphonic style of Palestrina, and his sacred compositional style did not conform to the style advocated in the press, Saint-Saëns was nonetheless a participant in the movement to reform and restrain sacred music. Salient style features of the Saint-Saëns Motets and the Gounod Messe, breve pour les morts and Messe funèbre, focusing on the ways in which the composer's approach is more restrained. It is difficult to trace the characteristics of the music associated with the church music reform movement in France. The primary reason for this is that the compositions associated with this movement were generally written for use in church services, and as such were not reviewed in the musical press. In addition, in many cases, these pieces were never published, and their manuscripts have since been lost. For the purposes of this study, the Latin-texted motets of Saint-Saëns and the second and third requiems of Charles Gounod will be presented as examples of the conservative style in French sacred music composition. In his recent study of Saint-Saëns' Latin-texted motets, Scott Glisson identifies 4 characteristics consistently employed by the composer in this segment of his oeuvre. 1. Musical choices that either support or enhance the natural stress and meaning of the Latin text. 2. Use of fully developed functional harmonic language typical of the 19th century. 3. Use of unobtrusive accompaniment. And 4. Subtle text and mood painting. In effect, Saint-Saëns was interested in preserving and highlighting the meaning of the liturgical text by the way he composed, and sought to do so using the full harmonic vocabulary of the 19th century. A similar approach was taken by some of Saint-Saëns' contemporaries, including Charles Gounod. Since both works are brief, the final document will include an analysis both of Gounod's Messe, breve pour les morts of 1873 and of his Messe funèbre of 1883, in order to gain a clearer picture of the techniques the composer employed. To highlight the differences between the Berlioz Requiem and the Gounod Requiems in question, I will discuss their salient style features in the same categories as the Berlioz. 1, the scale, both in terms of length and in terms of instrumentation. 2, the use of dynamics. 3, the prevailing musical texture, and 4, the harmonic language. 1. Scale. As was previously mentioned, the Gounod Requiems are significantly shorter in duration than the Berlioz Requiem, each only 10 to 12 minutes in length. This is primarily due to the fact that Gounod eliminates most of the text of the Requiem Mass. In both the 1873 Messe breve and the 1883 Messe funèbre, the only texts he sets are the Introit in Kyrie, the Sanctus, the Pie Jesu, and the Agnus Dei. The drastic reduction in duration is accompanied by a striking economy of forces. In the case of the Messe breve, the choir is accompanied by organ or piano, and in the case of the Messe funèbre, by organ ad libitum. As you will notice, this adheres strictly to the most restrictive calls of the Church and its reform-minded adherents regarding the use of instruments in church. Most of the Saint-Saëns Motets studied in Glisson's document use this same instrumentation. 2. Use of dynamics. Although the written dynamic range of the Gounod Requiems and Saint-Saëns Motets is similar to that of the Berlioz Requiem, the overall performing forces and dynamic context would render a very different effect for the listener. The dynamic range of these pieces ranges from double piano to double forte, but since the ensemble consists only of choir and organ, and since the choir would most likely have been a small church choir, the objective volume level would be much lower. Moreover, dynamic contrast is far less frequent and less dramatic. 3. Texture. The texture of both the Gounod Requiems and the Saint-Saëns Motets is almost exclusively homophonic, likely in response to the Church's call for the intelligibility of text. In those rare instances where the text does not perfectly line up in all parts, pains are taken to ensure that the text remains intelligible. This is typically done either by ensuring that the text overlaps by only a single syllable, or by repeating the text which has been obscured by overlapping, or both. 4. Harmonic language. While the harmonic language of Berlioz makes full use of the chromaticism that is typical of 19th-century compositions, the Gounod Requiems in question employ a drastically simplified harmonic language. Chromaticism is far less common, and when it does occur, it is generally in the form of modal mixture or brief modulations to very closely related keys. Although the harmonic language of the Saint-Saëns Motets is somewhat more adventuresome, it is similarly simplified in comparison to that of the Berlioz Requiem. It should be pointed out that although these style features do not conform to the strictest interpretations of the Church's call for reform, they nonetheless reflect the Church's desire for less theatricality and greater clarity of text. Discussion of stylistic influences in the Saint-Saëns Requiem. Scale. The scale of the Saint-Saëns Requiem falls somewhere between that of the Berlioz Requiem and that of the Gounod Requiems in question. The instrumentation, 4 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 English horns, 4 bassoons, 4 horns, 4 harps, 2 organs, and strings, is somewhat unusual, and certainly nowhere near as large as the Berlioz, but is nonetheless clearly more in line with the dramatic approach than the conservative approach. Moreover, although unlike the Gounod Requiems in question, the Saint-Saëns Requiem sets almost all the text of the Requiem Mass, it does so far more efficiently than the Berlioz Requiem. Whereas Berlioz dwells on lines of text in the interest of exploring their full dramatic potential, Saint-Saëns sets the text sensitively, but rarely dwells on or repeats a line of text. As a result, the overall length of the piece is only about 35 minutes, compared to 90 minutes or more for the Berlioz Requiem. It is also worth noting that Saint-Saëns' choice of instrumentation, while using instruments not specifically approved in Benedict XIV's encyclical, does not use any instruments specifically forbidden except 2, horns and harps. Moreover, his use of the wind instruments seems to act almost as a third organ, frequently changing color by introduction and elimination of individual instruments, but more often functioning harmonically and coloristically than motivically or melodically. One might thus view the instrumentation of Saint-Saëns' Requiem as 3 organs, harps, and strings. Use of dynamics. The piece makes use of dynamic contrasts typical of the dramatic style and practically never found in the conservative style. Saint-Saëns' application of dynamics, however, demonstrates greater restraint than Berlioz's. Although Saint-Saëns does employ dynamic contrast for dramatic effect, his overall dynamic range is slightly more restrained, extending only from double forte to triple piano, and generally moving from one extreme to the other over much longer spans of time. For an illustration of this, please see figures 1 and 2 in your handouts. Furthermore, dynamic extremes occur relatively infrequently, only occasionally moving beyond forte and piano. And at those times when it does move beyond that range, it is more often to pianissimo than to fortissimo. Overall, dynamic and expressive markings occur significantly less frequently than in the Berlioz, generally less than once per measure, compared to an average of at least once per measure in the Berlioz. Texture. It is in the texture of the Saint-Saëns Requiem that the influence of the conservative style is most evident. The texture of the piece is almost exclusively homophonic, sometimes broken up by antiphony between soloists and choir, and only occasionally by polyphonic textures. Furthermore, in the few instances where polyphony does occur, rather than simultaneously setting 2 or 3 different motivic ideas as Berlioz does, Saint-Saëns passes a single motive throughout the choir. See figures 3 and 4 in your handout. This results in an imitative polyphonic texture, which is therefore more uniform and thus less agitated than Berlioz's non-imitative polyphony. In addition, as in his motets and the 2 Gounod Requiems in question, this textural choice ensures the intelligibility of the words, allowing the meaning of the mass text to gain primacy over other musical concerns. Harmonic language. The harmonic language of the Saint-Saëns Requiem is the complex chromatic language typical of the late Romantic period, rather than the simplified harmonic language of the Gounod Requiems or the Saint-Saëns Motets. This includes frequent use of applied chords, modal borrowing, non-traditional progressions, and long-range tonal planning. This is made immediately apparent at the outset of the piece, where the first chord of the first movement is an Italian augmented sixth of the dominant. In other words, an Italian augmented sixth that leads to the dominant of the dominant. Similarly, the first chord of the second phrase is a French augmented sixth of the subdominant, and accented non-chord tones in both instances further obscure the already ambiguous off-tonic start. Moreover, the large-scale harmonic plan of the piece is coherent and complex, with, for example, the entire 7th movement serving as a prolonged Neapolitan harmony in preparation for the beginning of the 8th movement on the dominant. Conclusions. It is clear from his own statements, as well as from his approach to the composition of sacred music, that Saint-Saëns sought a different methodology in the composition of music for the church than that of many of his contemporaries. However, in the composition of the Requiem, he was presented with a compositional problem that was different from the problem of composing motets or liturgical masses. The text of the Requiem Mass, it seems, was too inherently dramatic for Saint-Saëns to simply ignore. Nevertheless, apparently out of respect for the Church, his approach to expressing the drama of the Requiem text is more subdued than that of his contemporaries. Indeed, his Requiem seems to have set the stage for the next generation of French Requiems, including Gounod's 4th Requiem of 1891, and those by Fauré and Duruflé, all of whose scale and mood are far more consistent with the Saint-Saëns Requiem than with Berlioz's. In the end, respect for the Church seems to have been the primary characteristic of Saint-Saëns' approach to all sacred music. This is surprising given the fact that Saint-Saëns himself was an atheist. In a letter to the Abbot Renaud, he declared his atheism by saying, quote, "I am not nearly an unbeliever, I am one completely," end quote. However, in the same letter, he also said, quote, "I know to respect that which is deserving of respect." Thank you.